Welcome back to the Wednesday Night Bible Study. We're in the 14th installment of a series called Hall of Faith. Last week we began looking at Joshua's story and how he exemplified faith. He was a successor to Moses in leading the Israelite people, and it was he who led the people crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. That's what we looked at last week. It was he, Joshua, who was instrumental in what happened in Jericho. We got right up to that point of this event last time. And the event was referred to in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 30. We'll read that now. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. In the book of Joshua, we read this in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. The last verses of chapter 5 in Joshua chapter 5. Here we go. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. I bring this up because this then flows into some instructions given by God for what Joshua and his people are to do. All right, so now we're ready for these specific instructions, starting in Joshua chapter 6. Begins with, "Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in." So the city of Jericho saw what was coming. They did see that this group of Israelites had crossed the Promised Land, crossed the Jordan River, crossed into the Promised Land, and they were advancing towards Jericho. So orders were given there at Jericho to close the gates and no traffic could go in or out. That's the setup then. Now, verse 2, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men.'" So this commander, the Lord himself, promised victory to Joshua. The city, its king, and its army would all fall to Israel. So I think it's a little confusing there to say, "I have delivered Jericho." Nothing's happened yet. Well, the tense of this Hebrew verb is something called prophetic perfect. It's describing a future action as if it were already accomplished. Since God had declared it, the victory was assured. So therefore, God says, "I have delivered Jericho to you," then it's as good as has happened, even though it has not happened yet. Now, what would be the battle plan? Here's these Israelite soldiers anxious to take down this city. The expectation would be ordinary weapons of war, maybe some battering rams and scaling ladders, because there was this huge wall. Maybe I'll show a picture of that next time. But anyway, these ladders, these battering rams, are not going to be what's going to happen, what's going to be employed. That's what the soldiers would have expected, but here their orders were very different. Looking at verse 3 now, this is God speaking, the Lord speaking. "March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the people will go up, every man straight in." So again, no battering rams, no ladders, no conventional military plans. You might wonder, what was the significance of the blaring trumpets? Well, in the Hebrew, it was Jubilee trumpets. These trumpets were used in connection with Israel's solemn feasts. They were used to proclaim the presence of God. So taking on Jericho wasn't exclusively a military undertaking, it was also a religious one. A scholar stated this: the trumpets declared that the Lord of heaven and earth was weaving his invisible way around this doomed city. God himself, in effect, was saying in the long blasts of these priestly trumpets what is said in Psalm 24, verse 7. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, your ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. When Christ returns, he, the King of glory, will enter cities in triumph. The conquest of Jericho is a similar kind of victory, a triumphant victory. Kind of gives us a little taste of God's second coming, God's return. Okay, so with these trumpets, Joshua and his armed men were to march around the city once a day, with 7 priests blowing their trumpets, preceding the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, they were to circle Jericho 7 times, and then bingo, the wall of Jericho would collapse and the city would be taken. In the Bible, that number 7 often symbolizes completeness or perfection. Notice there were 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days, and 7 times were on the wall on the 7th day. Having said that, the plan seems foolish, doesn't it? How does Joshua react to this plan? Does he think it's foolish? Does he run from such foolishness? Let's read how he unquestionably and faithfully put it into motion in verse 6. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the people, advance, march around the city, with the armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord. So no battle plan seemed more unreasonable than this one. Think about that. The army of Jericho, they're up on the, protected by the wall. They could easily rain down arrows and spears at them. The Israelites would be defenseless in this silent march around their city. Or the army of Jericho could come rushing out of the city gates and then break up Israel's line, separating them and then slaughtering them. Joshua was an experienced leader, military leader. I'm sure the non-logic to the plan crossed his mind, but he responded with an unquestioning obedience. He lost no time in calling together the priests and soldiers, passing on to them the directions he had received. Well, it's one thing for Joshua, a man of great faith, to accept the plan, but will the Israelite soldiers accept it? In verse 8, we read, when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time, the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the people, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the people returned to camp and spent the night there. All right, that first night, go around the city and then leave. So far, so good. Apparently the soldiers have faith too. They did as they were told. Somebody I ran across who looked into it figured that Jericho at that time covered about 8 or 9 acres. So it would take less than 30 minutes to march around. So imagine this 30-minute march. When they made the circle, instead of an immediate attack, which is maybe what the people of Jericho were expecting, they returned to camp. Well, let's keep going with verse 12. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. And now the moment of truth. Verse 16. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. There's the big finale here. The Hebrew term devoted, they're going to be devoted to the Lord, refers to the irrevocable giving over the things of or persons to the Lord, often by totally destroying them. In other words, the city and everything in it will be destroyed. That's devoting it to the Lord. Jumping a couple verses to verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. And so it happened, just as God had said it would. Those outnumbered Israelites, there were many more people there in Jericho. Those outnumbered Israelites, weary from years wandering through the wilderness, pulled off a major military upset. That's certainly got to be an inspiration to us all. It's kind of like the David and Goliath story, in the sense that big things can happen. I think the inspiration could be to trust in God. God will come through. God keeps his promises. He may have unusual ways he goes about things, but he knows what it's all about. A lot of times it's for our benefit, but it's also to give him glory. So when we face what seem like insurmountable obstacles, that's when we can rely on him the most. Many things come up which take faith in our lives, right? Maybe I should add, a little patience comes along. In this event, Jericho didn't immediately fall into Israel's hands. It required a whole 7 days of obedience and patience. Isn't that true of some things in our situations, in our circumstances, where things don't happen right away? It does require trust. It requires patience. And our solutions are often a lot different than God's. Sometimes they're so unexpected that it must be to test our faith. Maybe sometimes it is to test our faith. Maybe it did test Joshua's faith. We can only pray that we will pass the test just like Joshua did. So that's the end of Joshua's story as it relates to his faith. So until next time, take care. May the Lord be with you.